Hello, this is Nia, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 31st issue of the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump's executive order on NPR and PBS is unconstitutional, judge rules. The ruling will have minimal effect on the federal money going to public media because Congress voted to claw back funding, but it could have implications for any future funding. A federal judge ruled on Tuesday that President Trump's executive order barring the federal funding of NPR and PBS violated the First Amendment. Randolph Moss, a judge in the U.S. District Court of the District of Columbia, said in his ruling that Mr. Trump's order, signed last May, was unlawful because it instructed federal agencies to refrain from funding NPR and PBS because the president believed their news coverage had a liberal viewpoint. The message is clear. NPR and PBS need not apply for any federal benefit because the president disapproves of their left wing coverage of the news. Quotes Judge Moss wrote. But the First Amendment, he said, does not tolerate viewpoint discrimination and retaliation of this type. Unquote. The ruling will likely have minimal effect on the federal funding of public media. 2 months after the executive order, Congress voted to claw back roughly $500 million in annual funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the organization that distributes federal money to NPR and PBS. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting has since shut down, and public radio and TV stations across the country have sought alternative forms of revenue. But the ruling could have implications for any future money. Congress decides to allocate to public media, removing a hurdle that could have prevented lawmakers from restoring funding for NPR and PBS. The White House did not immediately respond for comment. Quotes. Today's ruling is a decisive affirmation of the rights of a free and independent press, end quotes, says Catherine Mayer, NPR's chief executive, said in a statement. PBS said in a statement that the judge's ruling affirmed that Mr. Trump's executive order imposed, quote, textbook unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination, end quote. NPR's lawsuit against the executive order upset some members of the public media community because it included the Corporation for Public Broadcasting as a defendant. NPR added that the corporation as a defendant because Mr. Trump's order directed it to deny NPR funding. NPR and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting eventually settled that dispute. In his opinion, Judge Moss wrote that the executive order, along with other public statements from the White House criticizing NPR reporting, including about Russia's attempt to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, quote, targets a disfavored viewpoint, end quote. Quote, it is difficult to conceive of clearer evidence that a government action is targeted at viewpoints that the president does not like and seeks to squelch, end quotes, Judge Moss wrote. Justice Department watchdog has gone silent, lawyers for whistleblowers say. Lawyers for a fired Justice Department lawyer says the agency's inspector general appears to have ignored at least 20 different requests to scrutinize misconduct. The Justice Department's internal watchdog has seemingly ignored 20 instances of possible wrongdoing by the Trump administration. Lawyers for whistleblowers said in a letter on Monday, urging lawmakers to address the, quote, apparent collapse, end quote, of an office meant to root out misconduct. The lawyer pointed to the case of their client, Ezra Reveny, who was fired in April last year amid a legal fight over the administration's decision to send migrants to a maximum security prison in El Salvador. It was only one of many issues that the department's Office of Inspector General appeared to have ignored, they said. Quotes. The epidemic of alleged misconduct has been met with a shrug by the agency whose job it is to address such allegations, end quote. They said in their letter, which was sent to the Republican and Democratic leaders of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. The Office of Inspector General did not respond to a request for comment. Since taking office, Mr. Trump has dismissed or demoted more than 20 inspector generals, sharply undermining the ability of the offices to act as a check or on misconduct, according to a congressional report. In the 2024 fiscal year alone, the inspector general fired by Mr. Trump identified more than $50 billion in waste and abuse. The Justice Department's Inspector General, Michael E. Horowitz, was spared in Mr. Trump's purge, but he left to oversee the Inspector General's office at the Federal Reserve in June. The role has since remained vacant, and William M. Blyer, the Deputy Inspector General, has served as the acting chief of the office. Mr. Ravuni, in whistleblower disclosure to Congress and the Inspectors General last year, accused senior administrators officials of trying to mislead federal judges and ignore court orders. A day after receiving Mr. Ravini's allegations, the Inspector General's office notified him that it did not plan to act. In a letter, it said that it had, quotes, thoroughly reviewed the material and concluded that the issues raised do not warrant an investigation by our office, end quotes. Quotes, accordingly, we will take no further action regarding your correspondence and consider the matter closed, end quotes. The letter continued. Mr. Ravuni's lawyer, Michael Bromwich, Donna L. Gold, Kevin L. Owen, and Kathleen Clark complained about the swift rejection, prompting the office to re-examine the issue. In January, the Inspector General again closed the case, according to correspondence among the lawyers. It said it would not investigate because of pending litigation surrounding Mr. Ravuni's allegations. And because the proper authority to examine such issues belongs to a different Justice Department entity, the Office of Professional Responsibility. Quotes, we view these as excuses for inaction rather than good faith concerns, end quote. Mr. Ravuni's lawyers wrote in their letter. The administration had decapitated the Office of Professional Responsibility, they said, referring to the firing last year of the lawyer who ran it. The Inspector General has long conducted far-reaching investigations into possible wrongdoing at the Justice Department. In particular, that has applied to the department's handling of politically sensitive cases, like the investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server and the inquiry into Donald J. Trump's 2016 campaign and potential ties to Russia. In the second Trump administration, however, the Inspector General's office has been noticeably quieter. Some lawyers for whistleblowers have complained that the office seems less willing or able to examine problems inside the department. At a time when the administration has fired more than 200 people from the FBI and Justice Department, many of whom worked on past cases related to Mr. Trump or his allies. Mr. Ravini's lawyers argue that the department is supplying a weak defense and stating that the other watchdog, the Office of Professional Responsibility, has the primary purview over accusations of lawyer misconduct. Quotes, instead of leaning into conduct an investigation of great importance implicating potential criminal misconduct by high level DOJ officials, the OIG makes excuses for why it will not undertake the investigations, end quote. The lawyers wrote, quote, those excuses for inaction reflect a failure of nerve and a shrinking of duty, end quote. The lawyer noted that lawmakers had asked for investigations of 20 different areas of potential misconduct at the Justice Department in the last year, and there has been no indication that the Inspector General is examining any of them. That failure does not include any private complaints or whistleblowing filings made by Justice Department employees. Devlin Barrett covers the Justice Department and the FBI for the Times. Will $4 gas hurt Trump's approval rating? Here's what history shows by Ruth Igelink and Catherine Chu. When gas prices spike, the approval rating for the president typically falls. Now that the war in Iran has pushed the national average price of gas above $4 a gallon, Republicans are watching closely to see if President Trump's approval ratings take a hit, which could dim the prospects of some of their House and Senate candidates in the midterm elections. Mr. Trump's approval rating has hovered around 40% in the New York Times polling average tracker for several months. It remains to be seen whether the recent spike in gas prices, which has been unusually rapid, will have an effect on them. There have been indications in recent years that the correlation between the price at the pump and approval ratings may be weakening. As the electorate has grown more polarized, but in this case, the price increase is clearly tied to Mr. Trump's decision to attack Iran. Just last month, Mr. Trump boasted in his State of the Union address that gas was, quote, below $2.30 a gallon in most states, end quote. On Tuesday, the national average hit $4.02, climbing above the $4 mark for the first time since August 2022, according to the AAA Motor Club. In some states, the average price at the pump is more than $5 a gallon, and in some counties, it is more than $6. Here's a closer look at how gas prices have historically stood apart as a key factor driving shifts in public attitudes towards the president. The Carter administration. In 1979, as gas prices soared to what would now be about $5 a gallon amid the energy crisis, President Jimmy Carter's approval ratings plummeted to around 30%. During that period, Mr. Carter did get a small rally in support with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, though it was short-lived. The Reagan administration. Lower gas prices through the 1980s were closely associated with higher approval ratings for President Ronald Reagan. The George W. Bush administration. In the summer of 2008, as gas prices surged to the equivalent of $6 a gallon when adjusted for inflation and the financial crisis raged, President George W. Bush's approval ratings steeply declined. The link may be weakening, but over the last decade and a half, the link between gas prices and approval ratings has gotten weaker. A University of Virginia Center for Politics Analysis found that while gas prices and approval ratings had been closely related for decades, the correlation has become less pronounced in the last 15 years. Quote, presidential approval ratings are far more stable in general than they used to be, end quote, said Kyle Kondik, a political analyst at the Center for Politics. Quote, you don't see big swings anymore, end quote. Polarization, he said, plays a large role in that change. Presidents have fairly unified support from their own party and unified oppositions from other party, which means they have a higher floor and a lower ceiling, end quotes, he said, referring to approval ratings. Still, the current gas spike could be different. The quick pace with which prices have jumped may be enough to upend that trend. Gas prices are also not the only thing driving voters' views of the president. As the war in Iran continues, the polls show that the public continues to largely disapprove of the military attacks, which could also contribute to lower approval ratings. But voters who support the attacks, said Alec Tyson, a pollster for Ipsos Public Affairs, have a much less negative view of how they will be affected financially by the conflict. Quote, it suggests that even price pressures at the pump may have limited impacts on the president's overall standing, end quotes, Mr. Tyson said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mortgage rates jump again as Iran war affects ripple through housing market, by Gregory Schmidt. The average rate on a 30-year mortgage in the United States hit 6.38%, the fourth increase since the war began. The war in the Middle East continued to weigh on the U.S. housing market as mortgage rates climbed for the fourth week in a row, squeezing Americans already struggling with high housing costs. The average 30-year fixed-rate mortgage rate climbed to 6.38%, according to the mortgage financing giant Freddie Mac, up from 6.22% the week before, and the highest level since the first week of September. The rate is still significantly below its peak of 7.79% in October 2023. Until the war started, rates had begun gradually declining, falling below 6% in the last week of February. The drop in rates had offered hope that more prospective buyers would enter the market, but rates have since marched steadily higher. Mortgage rates are influenced by the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, which has risen as the war deepens uncertainty for investors. Bond yields have jumped in the past few weeks, hitting 4.38% on Thursday, up from just under 4% before the war began. Disruptions to energy suppliers from the Middle East have led to surging oil and gas prices, intensifying fears of higher inflation. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development warned on Thursday that the war would push up inflation in the United States to 4.2% this year, more than a percentage point, higher than its previous forecast. A resurgence in inflation would make it more unlikely that the Federal Reserve would cut interest rates this year, an expectation that feeds into higher bond yields and mortgage rates. President Trump has said that Iran is willing to negotiate a possible ceasefire, a proposal that the Iranian government has publicly dismissed. The war is expected to slow the construction of new homes this year. According to a report from Oxford Economics, a global advisory firm, quotes, unless the war is brought to a quick end, higher mortgage rates and softer labor market conditions will weigh on residential spending this year, end quotes. Nancy Vanden Houghton, the firm's lead U.S. economist, wrote in the report. Around the Moon and Back in 10 Days by Marco Hernandez and Kenneth Chang. The 4 astronauts of the Artemis 2nd mission are preparing NASA for its next lunar landing. NASA is set to send 4 astronauts, 3 from the United States and 1 from Canada, on a trip around the moon and back without landing there. This is the first time that anyone would travel this far from Earth since Apollo 17 in 1972. If Artemis 2 succeeds, missions that return astronauts to the moon's surface could follow later in the decade. Here's what to know about the mission and the astronauts making the trip. What is the Space Launch System rocket? This is NASA's new big rocket, the present day equivalent of the Saturn V used during the Apollo moon landing. It is 322 feet tall and weighs 5.75 million pounds when filled with propellant. Launching from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, it is capable of sending about 60,000 pounds of payload to the moon. The design is a remix of technologies developed in the 1970s for the space shuttles. NASA led the design of the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion capsule, and it hired the commercial companies SpaceX and Blue Origin to provide the lunar landers for future Artemis missions. What is the Orion spacecraft? 4 astronauts were selected for the mission in 2023 and have been training for their journey since then. The 3 NASA astronauts, the commander, Reed Wiseman, the pilot, Victor Glover, and the mission specialist, Christina Koch, have been to the International Space Station. Mr. Glover is set to be the first black man to travel around the moon, and Ms. Koch, the first woman. A mission specialist from Canada, Jeremy Hansen, has not yet been to space. Mr. Hansen will be the first person who is not a NASA astronaut to make the trip. Orion is the spacecraft that will carry the astronauts to the moon and back. The top part, the crew module, will return to Earth, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. The Orion spacecraft has 2 main sections. During the 10-day mission, the astronauts are to remain inside the crew module. Beneath it sits the service module, a cylinder piece provided by the European Space Agency, which houses the propulsion, power, and life support systems. Built by Lockheed Martin and christened Integrity by the crew for the mission, the capsule can support 4 astronauts for missions up to 21 days. The capsule offers the interior volume of about 2 minivans, not enough space to offer crew members any privacy. The footpans on the pilot's and the commander's seats can be removed to free more space during work and sleep. In case of radiation events like a solar flare, the astronauts can shelter in the stowage lockers under the seats. Why is NASA going back to the moon? After Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, many felt that the space race with the Soviet Union was won, and the new lunar mission were not worth the expense. In the decades since, NASA has forced on low Earth orbit exploration with the space shuttles and the International Space Station. During the first Trump's administration, going back to the moon became a priority for NASA, and the program continued under President Joseph R. Biden Jr. The Artemis missions aim to explore the moon for scientific discovery and mine it for resources like frozen water for later space missions and helium-3 for future fusion power plants. Artemis 1, the first mission of the Artemis program, launched in November 2022, sent an unscrewed Orion capsule into orbit around the moon. Along the way, the mission deployed several small satellites known as CubeSats. Orion returned to Earth 26 days later. Artemis 2. This year's mission aims to test the life support and other critical systems on Orion. After separating from the upper stage of the rocket, the crew plans to test Orion's ability to execute docking maneuvers for future flights. If any serious problem arises while Orion is still in Earth's orbit, mission managers will bring the astronauts home. Once the spacecraft heads to the moon, it will be on what is known as a quote free return end quote trajectory. The moon's gravity will swing the capsule directly back to Earth without the need for any firing of the engines. That means the Orion capsule could return to Earth even if there were a failure of the propulsion system. As the Orion flies by the moon's far side, the astronauts will make observations of the lunar surface, including parts that have never been seen by human eyes. The Apollo missions were timed so that it was the beginning of the lunar day at the landing sites. This time, the moon will be in a different part of its orbit, so sunlight will be shining on some different parts of the far side. When the moon is between the spacecraft and Earth, communications with the astronauts will be interrupted for 30 to 50 minutes. Future Artemis missions. In February, NASA upended its plans for what happens after Artemis 2. Artemis 3 was supposed to be the keystone event, landing astronauts near the south pole of the moon by the end of 2028. Instead, it is now rescheduled to launch in mid 2027 and remain in Earth orbit as a test flight for practicing rendezvousings with one or both of the lunar landers that are under development by SpaceX and Blue Origin. And if it goes well, it could set up 2 landing attempts. Artemis 6 and Artemis 5 in 2028 that would meet President Trump's goal of sending NASA astronauts back to the moon before the end of his second term. Over the last 2 decades, NASA has spent more than $50 billion developing and building the Space Launch System. The Orion capsule and the accompanying ground systems needed to launch them. There is no simple price tag for just Artemis 2. Although a report by the NASA Inspector General in 2021 said each launch of the Space Launch System and Orion capsule cost about $4.1 billion. The Fragile Hope for Salmon Recovery in Maine by Murray Carpenter and Greta Ribas. On a bright March morning, Paul Christman hiked through deep snowdrifts on the bank of Avon Valley Brook in the western Maine mountains, leading a crew wearing waders and shouldering unwieldy backpacks. One crew member carried a pack basket loaded with battered funnels crafted from stovepipes, duct tape, and plumbing pipes. Another lugged a water pump. The last brought a cooler full of thousands of fertilized Atlantic salmon eggs. The stream was mostly iced over, but Mr. Christman, a marine scientist with the Maine Department of Marine Resources, found some open water on the brook, a tributary to the Sandy River. Quotes, "This is a really good spot," end quotes. Mr. Christman said, quotes, "The river is picking up velocity and shoving that water into the gravel, so we're going to set up right here and do it," end quotes. For 20 years, Mr. Christman has been working to restore salmon to the Sandy River watershed, where they were eradicated after dams built in the 1800s blocked their passage. The strategy is producing thousands of juvenile salmon that migrate to the North Atlantic, but just a handful that return to Maine to spawn as adults. Now, a $300 million project to remove or modify 4 dams downstream on the Kennebec River is infusing the work with new hope, possibly clearing the way for salmon to swim freely up the Sandy River within a decade. Hundreds of thousands of Atlantic salmon once flooded rivers in New England. For millenniums, the fish have been valued by Native Americans in the region as sustenance and cultural touchstones. But marine survival rates for Atlantic salmon have plummeted over the last 35 years for reasons that are complex and interwoven, including changing prey, shifting currents, and warming waters. More recently, they've been regarded by anglers as the king of fish. But by 2000, numbers had fallen so low that federal regulators listed them for protection under the Endangered Species Act. Early recovery efforts focused on the last remaining populations of Atlantic salmon in the United States, all in Maine, in the Penobscot River, and in the mid-coast and down east region. But Mr. Chrisman became intrigued with the Sandy River, which flows east from the mountains along the Appalachian Trail to the Kennebec River, and he believed the Foster watershed with cool, clean water to be an excellent habitat for salmon. Most of the Maine salmon populations are supported by stocking juvenile salmon from hatcheries. But in 2006, inspired by a prototype egg planter used in Alaska, Mr. Chrisman began reintroducing salmon to the Sandy River system using fertilized eggs instead. On that morning in early March, Avon Valley Brook was quiet except for the rippling water, calling blue jays and the winding chain saw from a distant logging operation. Quotes, "It's so beautiful out here in winter," end quotes, Mr. Chrisman said, wading in the stream. Quotes, "There's a peace and tranquility. It's almost prettier than it is in summer," end quotes. Then Gretchen Ramlow, a contractor with the State Marine Resource Agency, yanked a pull cord to fire up the water pump. Working together, crew members wriggled several pipes down a foot into the gravel, used the pump to clear a cavity at the base of the pipes, and dropped a scoopful of orange salmon eggs into each. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the front section of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As they removed the planting rigs, gravel covered the eggs. The process replicates salmon reds, where spawning salmon use their tails to dig depressions in the gravel to deposit their eggs. This technique allows juvenile fish to hatch from the gravel on their own schedule in the spring months, minimizing the hatchery's influence on the fish. After living in the fresh water for 2 or 3 years, the fish migrate seaward and spend 2 or 3 years maturing near Greenland. When they return to Maine as adults, Mr. Chrisman's team captures them at the first dam they encounter on the Kennebec River and trucks them upriver around 3 more dams to the Sandy River. He has shared his egg planting technique with fisheries biologists in Alaska, California, New York, the Canadian Maritimes, and Norway. It's a long process with a lot of uncertainty. Mr. Chrisman estimates that 25,000 eggs he planted that March day will produce 10,000 juvenile fish. Of these, one adult might return to the summer of 2029 or 2030. In all, the 495,000 eggs he and his colleagues planted this year could lead to the return of just about 20 adults. But the work is slowly paying off. Dozens of the adults returning from the ocean in recent years are the progeny of eggs planting on natural reproduction. a newer program to stock juvenile salmon below the dams, led by the Maine Department of Marine Resources and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is adding more adults that return. There were 102 in 2023. It's all leading to more salmon spawning on their own in the Sandy River system, and biologists have counted more than 100 reds some years. Andrea Gomez, a spokeswoman for NOAA Fisheries, said the federal recovery plan for Atlantic salmon envisioned self sustaining runs in three regions of Maine: down east, Penobscot, and Merrymeeting Bay. In that latter region, Dr. Gomez said the Sandy River stands out. Quote, it is the most significant source of naturally reared salmon in the southwestern part of the species range, end quote, Dr. Gomez says. The dams made it highly unlikely that the Sandy River would ever host a self sustaining run of salmon, but the odds improved in September. The Nature Conservancy, a global nonprofit environmental group, agreed to buy the four dams between the Sandy River and the ocean from Brookfield Renewable Partners, one of the world's largest publicly traded renewable power companies. The Conservancy is raising $168 million to buy the dams and begin the river restoration. Alex Maas, Deputy Director of the Conservancy in Maine, will lead the new Kennebec River Restoration Trust that is managing the project. Mr. Maas said the goal was, quote, to restore free-flowing conditions on the Kennebec for the benefit of all of the native sea-run fish and all of the communities that are connected to and dependent on the river, end quote. He said it could take 10 years and the cost an estimated $308 million. The project could include a mix of dam removal and other efforts in collaboration with the communities and businesses, including a large paper mill, Mr. Maas said. This would free the Kennebec River from tidewater to the confluence of the Sandy River and beyond. For the first time in more than a century, Sandy River salmon would be able to swim from the Gulf of Maine to their spawning grounds under their own steam. The project would continue the undamming of the Kennebec River and its tributaries that had began in 1999 with the demolishment of the Edwards Dam in Augusta. The deal has drawn opposition from the Sapai paper mill in Skowhegan that uses one of the dams for its water supply. And some lawmakers and business groups have lined up to support the mill's position. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will have to approve the deal, and opposition could stall the project. John Burroughs, Vice President of U.S. Operations of the Atlantic Salmon Federation, a nonprofit conservation group, has been closely following the recovery of Sandy River salmon. Quotes, to get back a self-sustaining wild population with four dams in place was never going to happen, end quotes, Mr. Burroughs said. The abundant cold water habitat in the Sandy River is considered increasingly valuable because of global warming. Quotes, it's a climate resilient landscape, high elevation and heavily forested, end quotes, Mr. Burroughs says. Quotes, it's an area that's going to remain supportive of Atlantic salmon well into the future, end quotes. The fish still face a steep uphill climb. In the early afternoon, at the last egg planting site of the day on Mount Blue Stream, Mr. Chrisman acknowledged the difficulties in trying to replenish the salmon's number, But he mentioned how he was encouraged by the sight of a dozen large salmon finning in a deep pool of the Sandy River on a summer day. Quotes, one of the greatest pleasure is to see the adults, end quote, he said. Quote, everything we do is to get the adults to spawn on their own. That's the end point of everything. A New Jersey teen finds treasure and more in abandoned storage units by Alex Van Dukel. On an icy afternoon, a 17-year-old named Michael Haskell parked his battered Hyundai outside a cavernous storage facility in Staten Island. Then he fetched the hand truck and wheeled it through a maze of 100 of identical units, its squeaking wheels echoing through the labyrinth. Quote, any of these could be a gold mine, unquote, he said. He stopped at number 3361 and unlocked the padlock. A musty odor emerged. He looked inside. This unit was crammed with bird cages, cedar chests, old paperbacks, bar stools, and Art Deco lamps. Quote, I think I'll make good money off this locker, which isn't bad since I bought it for $140, end quotes. Michael said, quote, copper is at $6 a pound right now, so I can sell the lamps to the scrapyard. It's all about squeezing every dollar out of the locker, end quotes. While some teenagers hang out after school playing Fortnite or shooting hoops, Michael has taken up a more enterprising hobby. He buys abandoned storage lockers at bargain prices from public lien auctions with the aim of selling their contents for profit. It began 2 years ago when he watched a rerun of Storage Wars. He has been on an urban treasure hunt since. His adventures have brought him to CubeSmart, Extra Space Storage, and Manhattan Mini Storage facilities in and around New York. He sells his scavenged goods through his eBay store, quote, Mike's Unique Treasures, end quotes, to earn over $7,000 a month, a figure backed by the financial records he showed me. He runs his operations out of the suburban New Jersey home where he lives with his mother. The garage is lined with meticulously indexed old magazines, vinyl records, World War II artifacts, rare stamps, VHS tapes, and vintage fishing rods. After finishing his homework, Michael spends his nights at work, packing inventory to ship to his customers around the country. Quotes, my friends tell me they're amazed I'm making money at this, end quotes, he said. Quotes, none have actually come along with me yet, though. I'm not sure why, end quotes. At the Staten Island facility, Michael took photographs of enticing objects and fed them into the AI image search, Google Lens, to get an idea of their value. Then he used a mechanical saw to break down tattered furniture with no selling potential. Quotes, I'm always on the search for the next Crispo, end quotes, he said, mowing away. Quotes, that was my first big score. He was referring to the haul that turned his hobby into a quest, a storage unit he bought in Brooklyn for $450 that had belonged to Andrew Crispo, a shadowy 1980s art dealer. Michael sold a Man Ray painting and some Walt Kuhn drawings he found inside for nearly $50,000. Quote, my family took my hobby seriously after that, end quote, he said. After clearing the Staten Island unit with the help of two movers he had hired through Facebook Marketplace, he got back into the Hyundai. It was so simple at the start when Michael got into the game of flipping used goods. He just wanted to make some money. But the business of dealing in people's abandoned possessions, it turned out, can be fraught. 2 years into his pursuit, he knows all too well that every locker tells a story, many of them bleak. Quote, I'm always trying to figure out the lives behind the units, end quotes, Michael said, as he drove toward another storage facility. Quote, this guy was really into antiques. Maybe he was a flipper like me, but who knows why he abandoned his unit. If you lose a locker, usually you're not financially stable and your life isn't in a great place. Sometimes it could be a sad story, end quote. Michael woke up at 7 a.m. the next day and rode the school bus to Bergen County Academics, where he is a senior. He took a math quiz and started writing an essay for English class about the poetry of Lucille Clifton. He tried not to worry too much about what he would hear back from colleges he had applied to Wesleyan, Emory, Hamilton, but he had one thing on his mind above all else: the next hunt, the next locker, the next treasure. On a recent afternoon at home in Bergen County, Michael was wearing fuzzy slippers as he scoured auction listings on lockerfox.com to plot his next targets. Not long ago, the room he sat in was filled with Legos. Now it's his office. It was decorated with finds: a Hermes 3000 typewriter, framed oil paintings, ancient Chinese faces. Quotes, they're Qing, not Ming, end quotes, Michael said. Quotes, Ming vases are the ones you want, end quotes. Beside the books and schoolwork on his desk were the tax documents his mother was helping him prepare. This year, he will file income taxes for the second time. There was also a plate of focaccia crackers, dried figs, and cheddar cheese that his mom had laid out. He took a long look at the intel generated by a computer program he had developed with ChatGPT. It listed storage units that had been abandoned by people whose name had appeared at some point in the news. One was connected to a politician in Piscataway, New Jersey. Another locker had belonged to a minor celebrity rapper known as Akil Pollard or Bobby Shmurda, the listing read. After an online search, Michael confirmed that Akil Pollard was the birth name of Brooklyn rapper Bobby Shmurda, whose viral accent in hip hop over a decade ago was cut short by headline making gang conspiracy charges. After nearly 7 years in prison, Mr. Shmurda was released in 2021. Michael paid $90 for his unit. From what I've read, it sounds like he was a one hit wonder and mostly became famous for going to prison, Michael said. Who knows? Maybe there's something valuable connected to his music career in there. Michael's mother, Anna Haskell, was in her study, reading the Wall Street Journal. Quote, it all started in middle school, end quotes, Miss Haskell, an investor, said. Quote, Michael would go to book fairs where he discovered he could buy books by the bag and resell them. Then he started researching Legos that were going out of production, and he started buying those up, reselling them as they got more valuable. Then he saw Storage Wars. Quote, I don't know what he could be one day, but what he's doing is almost like distressed investing, buying distressed assets. Quotes, end quotes. She added, maybe he'll go into the investment path. Miss Haskell considered what her son might be gaining from his locker dives aside from money. I think he's learning about human paths, about human nature, she said. People's lives are in these lockers. Belongings can tell you a lot about a person. When you meet someone, you might think you know them, but you just don't know. As Michael monitored outgoing deliveries in the garage, he told me about a unit in Hackensack that had belonged to a socialite. It was heaped with trash bags containing Prada dresses, Hermes scarves, and jewelry. There were also empty vodka bottles, divorce papers, and distressing financial documents. Her life had clearly fallen apart, he said. You think money solves all your problems? It doesn't. And there was a locker on the Upper East Side of Manhattan that had belonged to a relative of the first black mayor of Richmond, California. Michael showed me a yellowed local newspaper front page from 1964 that depicted him smiling as he took office. His name was George Carroll, Michael said. I read he was one of the first black mayors of a large American city. Looking at this picture, you can imagine the adversity he faced. He led an inspiring life, which wasn't the case with Crispo, he added. Crispo wasn't just connected to a murder, he was involved with so many other horrible things as well. About a year ago, one night after Michael cleared the locker of its valuable works of art, he searched the name, Andrew Crispo, online and learned about a harrowing crime that transfixed New York in the 1980s. A striver from Philadelphia who reinvented himself in Manhattan. Mr. Crispo made his name with his sharp eye for undiscovered painters and his championing of American modernism. After opening his namesake gallery on East 57th Street, he handled works by major figures like Edward Hopper and Georgia O'Keeffe. He became an artwork star and tabloid fixture known for the sadomasochistic sex parties that took place in his gallery after hours. One evening in 1984, Mr. Crispo and the gallery assistant Bernard Legros picked up a Norwegian art student named Egil Dag Vesti and brought him to an estate owned by Mr. Legros' parents in Rockland County, New York. After a drug-fueled night, Mr. Vesti was shot dead while naked and handcuffed. 3 weeks later, hikers discovered his corpse in a smokehouse, a zipped leather hood over the head. As Michael learned in his online sleuthing, the case became known as the Death Mask Murder. Mr. Legros was arrested and charged with the killing. Mr. Crispo denied involvement and was never charged, though the murder weapon, a .22 caliber rifle, was found hidden in his gallery. Mr. Crispo later served prison time for tax evasion and for threatening to kidnap a lawyer's 4-year-old child. He died destitute in 2024 in a Brooklyn nursing home, for causing his storage unit to go delinquent. Quote, he had a horrible ending, end quote, Michael said. Quote, I'm not sure what the lesson is. His life seems like a lesson in how not to live your life, end quote. The auction house, Bonhams, handled the artworks that Michael found in the Crispo locker. With his mother's help, he invested the proceeds from the nearly $50,000 sale into the S&P 500. There may be more windfall yet. Still unsold from the collection is a Eurobond ceremonial staff, which will soon go to auction. Bonhams has set the bidding at $4,500. But around the time that Crispo's grim life story left Michael feeling shaky about humanity, he came upon something quite different in a storage unit he had unlocked in Union City, New Jersey. Its contents seemed routine at first. Toolbox, hammer holsters, saw drills, some Spanish language comic books. But deep within the clutter, in a tattered box, Michael found a Purple Heart. After clearing the locker, he went on eBay and found a lively market for Purple Hearts. One could easily fetch $300, but he didn't list it. I felt I should return it, Michael said. I didn't have much to go on because I didn't have an owner's name for this unit, but there was a faded address on one package. The address brought him to a home with a rusted white fence in an immigrant enclave of Union City. A pair of dust-caked Timberland boots sat by the entrance. No one answered Michael's knocks at the door. No one answered his calls after he pulled the phone number through public records. Then he sent a letter. He is still waiting to hear back. He keeps the Purple Heart in a drawer. Quotes, selling it would be disrespectful to a life, to someone who fought for something even if I don't know who they are, end quotes. Michael said, quotes, I'll never sell it, end quote. On an overcast Monday afternoon, Michael endured another math quiz before leaving school to investigate the Bobby Shmurda unit. Walking through the cold toward the car, he ran into Scott Demeter, his junior year history teacher. What Michael is doing is what education should look like, Mr. Demeter said. So many teens just want to get picked up as an influencer now, but he's doing something that involves entrepreneurial spirit and risk taking. He's generating real income too, he added. I just joked with a colleague that we should quit our jobs and do what Michael's doing. After the drive, Michael arrived at a storage facility in Edgewater, New Jersey, and made his way inside. He found Mr. Shmurda's unit at the end of a long, dark hall. Its blue metal door rattled as he heaved it open. To his dismay, there was nothing of note inside. A set of weights, a plasma TV, a pair of loudspeakers. Maybe the speakers are worth something, he said. Otherwise, this is junk. His name isn't written on anything, so no one will ever believe me that this is Shmurda's stuff. Ever in hope of a jackpot, Michael made his way to a storage post facility in Long Island City. The unit had not been flagged by his ChatGPT assisted search bot, but he figured it was worth a shot. He unlocked the door and scowled. It was filled with gym clothes, cookbooks, a VCR, and a plant pot. But as he rummaged through the boxes, he grew interested in the life behind all the seemingly worthless stuff. The dusty Ampex tapes, recording masters, and sheets of paper scribbled with lyrics suggested a working musician. Old photos depicted a handsome singer in the 1970s, Prime, hanging out in the studio with his band. Buried deep in the unit, Michael found a few records by a soul musician named Andre Anthony Waters. On the cover of his 1988 album, Heat Up the Night, he wore a leather jacket with a pop collar as he stared coolly into the camera. Michael searched his name on his phone but didn't turn up much, not even a Wikipedia page. You can see his hopes and dreams in this locker, he said. It looks like he never really made the big time, though. It's clear his music was everything to him. I doubt I'll make much off this unit, but this was a good life story. He started heaving the boxes into the hall. But you can't get too attached, he said. It's still got to sell. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 31st issue of the front section of the New York Times. We read from the front section of the New York Times every Sunday at 1 p.m. Your reader has been Neil Holmes. Thank you for listening.